In 1897, photographer Edmund Hartwell captured what appeared to be the perfect wedding portrait of Catherine and William Morrison in their Salem home. The photograph showed a radiant bride, her beaming groom, and gathered family members celebrating their union. However, when the glass plate negative was developed, an unexplained shadow appeared directly behind Catherine, a dark, human-like silhouette that no one remembered being present during the sitting. Within 3 months of the wedding, Catherine would be found dead in her bridal chamber under circumstances that would haunt the Morrison family for generations, and the photograph would become the centerpiece of Salem's most enduring mystery. The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of the Morrison estate, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors, as Edmund Hartwell adjusted his camera equipment with the practiced precision of a man who had spent 15 years capturing the most important moments of Salem's elite families. The wedding photograph was meant to be simple, a formal portrait to commemorate the union of Catherine Whitmore and William Morrison, two of the town's most prominent young people whose families had built their fortunes on the shipping trade that flowed through Salem's busy harbor. The estate itself stood as a testament to the Morrison family's prosperity, its 3 stories of red brick and white trim rising from manicured gardens that overlooked the harbor where merchant vessels brought wealth from distant shores. Catherine stood perfectly still in her ivory silk gown, the fabric imported from France at considerable expense, its intricate beadwork catching the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. Her dark hair had been pinned with her grandmother's pearl combs, heirloom pieces that had traveled from England 3 generations earlier, when the first Whitmore patriarch had established his trading empire in the New World. The dress itself represented months of planning and fittings, its design based on the latest European fashions, but modified to accommodate the more conservative sensibilities of Salem society. Every detail had been carefully considered, from the delicate lace trim that bordered the neckline to the tiny pearl buttons that traced the length of her spine. William positioned himself beside her with the confident bearing of a man who had never known want or worry, his morning coat perfectly tailored and his stance reflecting the military training he had received at West Point before returning to Salem to assume his role in the family business. At 26, he possessed the kind of assured masculinity that made mothers throughout the county consider him an ideal match for their daughters. But his attention had been captured entirely by Catherine from the moment they had met at a summer cotillion 2 years earlier. The courtship had proceeded according to the rigid social protocols of their class, with carefully chaperoned visits and formal correspondence that gradually revealed the genuine affection growing between them. The gathered family members arranged themselves in the traditional formation that Hartwell had orchestrated dozens of times before, their faces bearing the solemn expressions that the long exposure time demanded. Catherine's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, stood to her daughter's right, her own wedding dress from 30 years earlier carefully preserved and displayed in the background as a symbol of matrimonial continuity. William's father occupied the position of honor behind his son, his weathered hands folded in front of him in a gesture that spoke of decades spent building the shipping empire that would soon pass to the next generation. The assembled aunts, uncles, and cousins filled out the composition, each person acutely aware of their role in documenting this moment for posterity. The photographer counted off the seconds, watching through his viewfinder as the assembled group held their poses with Victorian discipline, their faces gradually settling into the serious expressions that would be preserved forever on the glass plate negative. The room itself seemed to hold its breath during those crucial 30 seconds, the only sound coming from the grandfather clock in the corner that marked the passage of time with mechanical precision. Hartwell had chosen this particular hour of the afternoon specifically for the quality of light that entered through the western windows, creating the kind of natural illumination that would render every detail with crystalline clarity. What Hartwell saw through his lens that October afternoon was unremarkable, a prosperous family celebrating a joyous occasion in their well-appointed parlor. The room exemplified the refined taste of Salem's merchant class, with its imported wallpaper from London, oriental carpets from Persia, and furniture crafted by the finest cabinet makers in Boston. Oil paintings of family patriarchs gazed down from gilded frames, their stern faces reflecting the seriousness with which these families approached the accumulation and preservation of wealth. Crystal decanters on the sideboard caught the afternoon light, while fresh flowers from the estate's greenhouse added splashes of color to the otherwise formal setting. The bride radiated the quiet happiness expected of a young woman making an advantageous match, her eyes bright with anticipation for the future she was about to embrace. Catherine had been educated at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, where she had learned not only the academic subjects considered appropriate for women of her station, but also the subtle arts of managing a household, entertaining guests, and supporting her husband's business and social ambitions. Her correspondence with friends from school revealed a young woman of intelligence and sensitivity, someone who approached marriage not merely as a social obligation, but as an opportunity to build something meaningful with a partner she genuinely loved. William displayed the satisfaction of a man securing both love and social standing, his expression revealing the deep contentment of someone who had found exactly what he had been seeking in life. His business training had taught him to evaluate opportunities with careful consideration, but his feelings for Catherine transcended mere calculation. In the months leading up to their wedding, he had spoken to his closest friends about his belief that he had discovered a rare compatibility with someone who shared not only his social background, but also his deeper values and aspirations. The prospect of building a life together, of establishing their own household, and eventually raising children who would continue both family legacies, filled him with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere duty. Even the elderly relatives maintained their composure, despite the strain of remaining motionless for nearly 30 seconds, their faces bearing witness to decades of similar family celebrations, and the understanding that this moment represented another link in the chain of generations that connected past to future. Great-aunt Millicent, now 83 and the last surviving member of her generation, remembered her own wedding portrait from 1834, when the process had been even more cumbersome and the results far less reliable. The technological advances represented by Hartwell's modern equipment seemed miraculous to someone who could remember, when any kind of permanent image required hours of sitting for a skilled artist. Nothing in that moment suggested that death was already present in the room, waiting with infinite patience for its moment to claim what it had come for. The atmosphere was one of celebration and anticipation, filled with the kind of hopeful energy that surrounds young people embarking on their life together. Conversations before the formal portrait had centered on plans for the honeymoon trip to Europe, discussions of where the newlyweds would establish their own household, and gentle speculation about future grandchildren. The shadow of mortality seemed impossibly distant from this gathering of healthy, prosperous people at the height of their social and economic power. The glass plate negative sat in Hartwell's chemical baths for the prescribed time, developing slowly in the red-lit confines of his darkroom. His studio occupied the entire third floor of a building on Federal Street, with north-facing windows that provided the consistent, natural light essential for his portrait work, and a darkroom equipped with the latest developments in photographic technology. Hartwell had invested heavily in his equipment, understanding that his reputation depended not only on his artistic eye, but also on the technical quality of his work. The chemical process itself was one he had refined through years of experience, adjusting temperatures and timing to achieve the rich tonal range that distinguished his photographs from those of less skilled practitioners. He had processed hundreds of similar plates, each one emerging to reveal the expected faces and forms captured by his camera's unblinking eye. The routine had become almost meditative, the careful timing of chemical baths, the gradual emergence of the image from blank glass, the moment of revelation when all the technical preparation culminated in a successful capture of light and shadow. Hartwell took pride in his consistency, in his ability to deliver results that met the exacting standards of Salem's most demanding families. His reputation had been built on reliability as much as artistry, on the certainty that families could trust him to preserve their most important moments with the dignity and precision they deserved. But when this particular image materialized in the developer, Hartwell found himself staring at something that challenged everything he understood about the science of photography. The familiar faces emerged as expected: Catherine's serene beauty, William's confident bearing, the assembled family members in their carefully arranged positions. Every detail appeared with the clarity he had worked to achieve, from the intricate beadwork on the bride's gown to the subtle expressions that revealed each person's emotional state. Yet there, standing directly behind the bride's left shoulder, was something that defied rational explanation, the unmistakable silhouette of a figure that had not been present during the sitting. The shadow possessed a distinctly human shape, tall and thin, with what appeared to be long hair, or perhaps a flowing garment that seemed to move despite the static nature of the photograph. The figure stood approximately the same height as Catherine herself, but its form was rendered entirely in shadow, as if light passed through it rather than reflecting off solid flesh. Most unsettling was how the figure appeared to be reaching toward Catherine, its shadowy appendages extending in her direction with an intimacy that suggested familiarity rather than malevolence. The positioning was deliberate and purposeful, as if the shadow figure had chosen to stand exactly where it would be closest to the bride without interfering with the other family members. The background wall behind the family was clearly visible in other areas of the photograph, its textured wallpaper and decorative molding rendered in perfect detail. This ruled out any possibility of a double exposure or technical error in which two separate images had been accidentally combined on the same plate. The shadow figure appeared to exist within the same physical space as the family, occupying the same plane of focus and exhibiting the same optical properties as the other elements in the scene. Whatever had impressed itself onto the glass plate had been present in that room, invisible to the human eye, but somehow captured by the camera's mechanical vision. Hartwell examined the negative under multiple light sources, holding it up to windows, lamplight, and even the focused beam of a magnifying glass equipped with its own illumination. Each examination revealed new details about the mysterious figure, the suggestion of facial features within the shadow, the way its form seemed to interact with the light patterns in the room, the precise positioning that placed it in relationship to Catherine while remaining invisible to everyone else present. The photographer checked his equipment for defects, examining the camera body, lens and plate holder for any mechanical problem that might have created such an anomaly. He consulted with a colleague in Boston who specialized in photographic anomalies, sending a detailed description of the image along with precise technical specifications about his equipment and process. The response was both thorough and mystifying. Every technical explanation was systematically eliminated through careful analysis. The shadow was neither a flaw in the glass nor a mistake in the developing process. It was not the result of stray light entering the camera, nor was it caused by improper chemical preparation or temperature variations in the darkroom. According to every principle of photographic science, the image should not exist. The colleague requested to see the actual negative, making the journey from Boston to Salem specifically to examine Hartwell's work firsthand. His inspection lasted several hours and included tests with specialized equipment, designed to detect various types of photographic fraud or error. The conclusion was inescapable. Something had existed in the physical space of the Morrison parlor on that October afternoon, something that had interacted with the light in ways that only the camera could detect. The shadow figure was as real, from a photographic perspective, as any of the human subjects in the portrait. The wedding celebration proceeded as planned, with Catherine and William hosting an elegant reception that lasted well into the evening. The Morrison estate had been transformed for the occasion, with flowers from Boston decorating every room and musicians brought in from New York to provide entertainment for the 200 guests who represented the cream of New England society. The reception rooms glowed with the light of hundreds of candles, while servants moved silently through the crowd, ensuring that champagne glasses remained filled and that the elaborate dinner service proceeded without interruption. Guests remarked on the bride's unusual radiance, how her eyes seemed to hold a light that made her more beautiful than anyone had ever seen her. Catherine moved through the receiving line with a grace that appeared almost otherworldly, her responses to congratulations carrying a warmth that seemed to touch each guest personally. Women who had known her since childhood commented to one another that marriage seemed to have awakened something in her, some inner luminosity that had not been visible during her unmarried years. Even her voice carried a different quality that evening, softer and more melodious than usual, as if she had been touched by something beyond the ordinary realm of human experience. She danced with a grace that defied the elaborate construction of her wedding gown, her movements so fluid that several observers later claimed she seemed to float across the ballroom floor. The orchestra leader, a professional musician who had performed at countless society weddings, would later tell his friends that he had never seen a bride dance with such natural rhythm and expression. Catherine's face during the dancing seemed illuminated from within, her smile containing depths of happiness that transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely radiant. Partners who danced with her during the evening's festivities reported that she seemed lighter than air, that guiding her through the steps required no effort at all. William noticed the change in his new wife immediately, though he attributed it to the natural happiness of a woman on her wedding day. Their first private moments together, after the ceremony, had revealed a Catherine who seemed somehow more present and alive than he had ever seen her, her conversation sparkling with insights and observations that suggested an expanded awareness of the world around her. She spoke of feeling connected to things she had never understood before, of sensing the history embedded in the rooms of his family's house and the stories contained in objects that had previously seemed merely decorative. During their wedding night, Catherine described dreams that were more vivid than any she had ever experienced, dreams filled with places she had never seen and people she had never met, but who felt as familiar as family. These visions came to her in the drowsy moments between waking and sleeping, populated by figures dressed in clothing from earlier eras, who moved through landscapes that combined elements of Salem with locations that seemed to exist only in imagination. She described walking through gardens that existed in perpetual twilight, where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, and the air itself seemed to whisper secrets that she could almost but not quite understand. The gardens in her dreams were unlike anything in the natural world, filled with plants that combined familiar forms with fantastical variations that challenged the laws of botany. Trees bore fruit that glowed within a light, while flowers opened to reveal complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change as she observed them. The paths through these dream gardens were made of materials that felt solid underfoot, but appeared to be constructed from crystallized moonlight or compressed starshine. Most remarkably, these dreams felt more real than her waking hours, more true than the world they inhabited together in the Morrison family home. As the weeks passed following the wedding, Catherine's behavior grew, increasingly erratic in ways that defied easy explanation. The changes began subtly, a tendency to pause in conversations as if listening to someone else speaking, moments of distraction during which her eyes would focus on empty corners of rooms as if something there demanded her attention. She would be found standing in empty rooms, apparently engaged in conversations with invisible companions, her voice taking on inflections and speech patterns that were entirely unlike her usual manner of speaking. The conversations seemed to follow a logical pattern, with pauses that suggested she was listening to responses from her unseen interlocutors. Servants reported seeing her walking the halls at night, dressed in her wedding gown, carrying on animated discussions with the shadows that danced on the walls. These nocturnal wanderings followed a regular pattern, beginning always in the master bedroom and proceeding through a specific route that included the parlor where the wedding photograph had been taken, the library where William conducted his business correspondence, and ending in the conservatory where Eleanor Whitmore had cultivated her prize-winning orchids. The servants learned to recognize the sound of Catherine's footsteps and the soft murmur of her voice, though they could never make out the words she spoke or understand the language she seemed to be using. During the day, she would spend hours staring at the wedding photograph that Hartwell had eventually delivered, her finger tracing the outline of the mysterious figure that appeared behind her image. The photograph had been mounted in an elaborate silver frame and displayed prominently on the mantelpiece in the front parlor, but Catherine's intense focus on the shadow figure made other family members increasingly uncomfortable. She would stand before the image for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, sometimes speaking in whispers to the photograph as if the people in it could hear and respond to her words. William consulted with the family physician, Dr. Marcus Thornbury, who had served the Morrison and Whitmore families for over 2 decades and possessed a reputation for both medical skill and discretion. Dr. Thornbury's examination of Catherine was thorough and professional, including tests of her reflexes, evaluation of her mental faculties, and careful questioning about her physical and emotional state. He could find no physical ailment to explain his patient's condition, no fever or infection that might account for her unusual behavior, no sign of the nervous exhaustion that sometimes affected young women adjusting to the responsibilities of marriage. Her appetite remained normal, Her sleep patterns showed no significant disruption beyond the nighttime wandering, and she displayed no signs of the hysteria or melancholia that were the most common diagnoses for women experiencing psychological distress. Catherine's responses to questions were lucid and intelligent. Her memory for recent events was clear and accurate, and her emotional responses to family members remained appropriate and loving. Yet something fundamental had changed in her, as if her wedding day had opened a door that could not be closed, allowing something from beyond the threshold of normal experience to enter her world and claim residence in her soul. Dr. Thornbury's written report, preserved in the family papers, described a patient who exhibited unusual behaviors, consistent with no known medical condition, suggesting the influence of factors beyond the scope of traditional healing arts. The language was carefully chosen to avoid any suggestion of supernatural influence, while acknowledging that Catherine's condition lay outside his professional expertise. He recommended continued observation and suggested that the family might consider consulting with specialists in Boston who dealt with disorders of the nervous system, though he privately doubted that. Conventional medicine would provide adequate answers. The truth revealed itself on a cold January morning when William discovered Catherine in their bedroom, still wearing her nightgown, her body positioned exactly as she had stood in the wedding photograph. She lay on her side with her arm extended toward the same spot where the shadow had appeared in Hartwell's image, her face bearing an expression of profound peace that suggested she had finally found what she had been seeking in her dreams. The position was so precise that it seemed deliberate, as if Catherine had arranged herself to mirror the pose captured in the photograph months earlier. The room was undisturbed, the windows locked from the inside, and no sign of violence or struggle marked the scene. Catherine's nightgown was perfectly arranged, her hair spread across the pillow in a way that suggested peaceful sleep rather than distress. The only unusual element in the room was the temperature, despite the January cold and the fact that the fireplace had not been lit the previous evening. The bedroom was warm enough that condensation had formed on the windows. The warmth seemed to radiate from Catherine's body itself, as if some internal source of heat had been activated during her final hours. The family physician arrived within an hour of William's summons, but his examination revealed no cause of death that could be determined through conventional medical investigation. Catherine's body showed no signs of disease, injury, or poisoning. Her heart appeared healthy, her lungs clear, her vital organs functioning normally at the time of death. Dr. Thornbury could record only that Catherine Morrison had apparently died in her sleep at the age of 22, her death as mysterious as the changes in her behavior had been during the preceding months. The wedding photograph was discovered clutched in Catherine's hand, though no one could explain how it had come to be there since the framed image had been left on the mantelpiece in the parlor when the family retired for the evening. The glass was cracked in a precise line that ran directly through the mysterious shadow figure, creating a fracture that seemed to pulse with its own inner light when viewed from certain angles. The crack had not been present when the photograph was last examined, and its appearance during the night of Catherine's death suggested some connection between the image and the events that had transpired. When the damage occurred, remained unknown, but the crack seemed to divide the shadow figure into two distinct parts, while simultaneously making it more visible and defined than it had been in the original image. Family members who examined the photograph after Catherine's death noted that the shadow seemed to have changed position slightly, moving closer to Catherine's image and extending its reaching gesture in a way that seemed to bridge the gap between the photograph and the physical world. Some observers claimed that the crack itself seemed to move or shift when viewed peripherally, though direct examination always showed it to remain constant. William ordered the photograph destroyed, unable to bear the sight of an image that had become associated with his wife's mysterious death and the unexplained phenomena that had preceded it. However, the servants who were tasked with the disposal reported that normal methods of destruction proved ineffective. Attempts to burn the photograph in the kitchen fireplace resulted in flames that would not consume the glass plate or even the wooden frame, while efforts to break the glass with hammers produced only additional cracks that made the shadow figure more distinct rather than eliminating it entirely. The servants reported that the glass plate emerged from fires unmarked and unchanged, the shadow figure perhaps even more distinct than before, as if the heat had somehow enhanced whatever process had originally created the image. One housekeeper claimed that she had seen the shadow figure move within the photograph during her attempts to destroy it, turning its head to look directly at her, with eyes that seemed to contain depths of knowledge and sorrow that no human could comprehend. These reports, dismissed by William as the products of overwrought imaginations, nevertheless created an atmosphere of fear and superstition around the photograph that made it impossible for the family to keep it in their home. Hartwell himself became obsessed with understanding what his camera had captured that October afternoon, dedicating increasing amounts of time to researching the history of the Morrison property and the technical aspects of photographic anomalies. His investigation revealed that the land on which the Morrison house stood had a complex and troubled history that extended back to the earliest days of Salem's settlement. The site had originally served as the location of the town's first cemetery, established in 1629 when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was still struggling to establish itself in the harsh New England wilderness. The cemetery had served the community for nearly 2 centuries, receiving the bodies of Salem's earliest settlers, victims of the various epidemics that periodically swept through colonial communities, and those who had died during the infamous witch trials of 1692. Records from the colonial period indicated that burials had continued on the site until 1847, when the expanding town required the land for residential development, and the bodies were relocated to Salem's newer cemeteries on the outskirts of the community. The exhumation process had been supervised by the town selectmen and carried out according to the standards of the time, but the work had been complicated by the age of many graves and the deterioration of wooden caskets and markers. Local records suggested that several bodies had never been found during the exhumation process, their graves either unmarked or marked, with wooden posts that had rotted away during the intervening centuries. The official report noted that all reasonable efforts had been made to locate and relocate the remains, but acknowledged that some graves might have been missed due to the incomplete nature of early burial records and the practical difficulties of locating graves that lacked permanent markers. The land had been sold to Morrison's grandfather in 1848, with the understanding that any remains discovered during construction would be properly relocated at the buyer's expense. Hartwell's research uncovered newspaper accounts from the construction period that mentioned the discovery of several previously unknown graves during the excavation for the house's foundation. The bones had been carefully collected and reinterred in Greenlawn Cemetery with appropriate religious ceremonies, but the newspaper reports noted that local workers had complained of strange occurrences during the construction process. Tools would go missing and reappear in different locations. Cold spots would develop in specific areas of the construction site, regardless of weather conditions, and several workers reported seeing figures moving through the partially completed structure during evening hours when no one was supposed to be present. The photographer began to believe that his equipment had somehow documented the presence of someone who had been buried on that land decades before Catherine was born, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they considered their rightful place in the world of the living. This theory was supported by his discovery of a burial record from 1694 that mentioned a young woman named Sarah Whitmore, possibly an ancestor of Catherine's family, who had died at the age of 21 under circumstances that the colonial records described only as mysterious and troubling to the godly community. Further investigation revealed that Sarah Whitmore had been engaged to marry a prominent young merchant at the time of her death, and that she had died on what was to have been her wedding day. The colonial records were frustratingly vague about the specific circumstances, referring only to unnatural events and manifestations that defied Christian understanding. Sarah had been buried in what the records described as the northeast corner of the burying ground, an area that corresponded exactly to the location where the Morrison parlor would be constructed a century and a half later. The connection between the two young women, both members of prominent Salem families, both engaged to advantageous marriages, both dying under mysterious circumstances, seemed too significant to dismiss as coincidence. Hartwell theorized that the photographic process had somehow captured evidence of Sarah Whitmore's continued presence on the land where she had been buried, and that Catherine's own connection to the Whitmore family line had made her particularly susceptible to whatever influence or communication Sarah was attempting to establish. The Morrison family abandoned the house within 6 months of Catherine's death, unable to bear the weight of memories that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, rather than lighter with the passage of time. The decision was not made lightly. The house represented a significant financial investment and held deep emotional significance as the home where William had been born and raised. However, the psychological burden of remaining in a place so strongly associated with tragedy and unexplained phenomena proved too great for the family to endure. William reported to friends that the house seemed different after Catherine's death, that rooms which had once felt warm and welcoming now carried an atmosphere of watchful waiting that made normal family life impossible. Temperatures would fluctuate inexplicably, with some rooms becoming uncomfortably warm, while others remained persistently cold, regardless of heating efforts. Servants complained of hearing footsteps and voices in empty parts of the house, while family members reported dreams that seemed to continue Catherine's experiences of otherworldly gardens and whispered conversations with invisible companions. The sale of the property proved more difficult than expected, as potential buyers seemed to sense something troubling about the house, even when they were not informed about the recent tragedy. Several promising negotiations fell through at the last minute, with buyers citing vague concerns about the atmosphere or feeling of the property. Eventually, the house was sold to a family from Boston who had no knowledge of its history, though they would report similar unexplained phenomena within months of taking residence, and would themselves sell the property after less than 2 years. William remarried 3 years later to a quiet young woman from a respectable Cambridge family, choosing someone whose temperament was as different from Catherine's as possible. His second wife, Margaret Thornley, was practical and conventional, possessed of the kind of steady character that seemed immune to flights of fancy or susceptibility to unusual influences. Their marriage was comfortable and produced 2 children. But friends noted that William never spoke of his first wife except in the most general terms, and that he seemed to carry a sadness that no amount of conventional happiness could entirely dispel. The wedding photograph remained in William's possession until his own death in 1934, carefully wrapped and stored in a locked trunk that also contained Catherine's jewelry, her wedding dress, and a collection of letters she had written during the weeks preceding her death. These letters, discovered by his children after the funeral, revealed the extent to which Catherine had been affected by her mysterious experiences. Written in her own hand, but displaying a knowledge of historical events and people that she could not have possessed through normal means, the letters described conversations with figures from Salem's colonial past and detailed information about the early settlement of the town that was later verified through historical research. One letter, dated just a week before her death, described a conversation with my dear sister Sarah, who had told her about the difficulties of remaining connected to the world of the living when one's physical form had been released to the earth. Catherine wrote about learning the techniques needed to maintain consciousness after death, and expressed her growing understanding that some forms of love transcended the boundaries between life and death. The letter concluded with her assertion that she was learning how to step between the worlds, and that she looked forward to the day when she would no longer be constrained by the limitations of physical existence. The trunk containing these materials was discovered along with a letter addressed to William's children, warning them never to display the photograph or allow it to be viewed by pregnant women or young brides. The letter, written in William's careful handwriting, described the photograph as containing influences that can affect susceptible individuals in ways that rational men cannot understand or control. He advised his children to either destroy the image completely or ensure that it remained locked away where it could not inadvertently expose vulnerable people to whatever power it contained. Edmund Hartwell continued his photographic practice until 1912, but he never again accepted commissions for wedding portraits, claiming that such occasions carried too much emotional intensity for safe photographic documentation. His later work focused primarily on architectural subjects and landscapes, images that seemed unlikely to contain the kind of human emotional resonance that might attract supernatural attention. He became something of an expert on photographic anomalies, consulting with other photographers who encountered unexplained elements in their work and developing techniques for identifying and avoiding conditions that seemed conducive to unusual phenomena. Hartwell claimed in his later years that cameras could see things that human eyes were not meant to perceive, that the mechanical process of capturing light could sometimes trap more than just the reflection of the physical world. He theorized that certain emotional states, particularly those associated with significant life transitions like weddings or funerals, could create conditions in which the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds became temporarily permeable. His technical journals from this period contained detailed observations about the relationship between emotional intensity and photographic anomalies, suggesting that strong feelings could somehow influence the behavior of light itself. His equipment was sold after his death to a photographer in New York named Marcus Delacroix, who reported experiencing similar anomalies in his own work within months of acquiring Hartwell's cameras and developing equipment. Delacroix's first unusual photograph captured what appeared to be additional figures at a family reunion, elderly people dressed in clothing from an earlier era who seemed to be observing the festivities from the background of the image. These figures were not visible to anyone present during the actual event, but appeared clearly in the developed photograph, their faces bearing expressions of fond recognition as they watched their descendants celebrate together. The pattern continued with increasing frequency, leading Delacroix to research the history of Hartwell's equipment and discover the connection to the Morrison wedding photograph. Eventually, Delacroix consulted with a priest at St. Patrick's Cathedral, who agreed to bless the equipment after examining several of the anomalous photographs and concluding that they represented evidence of benevolent spiritual presence rather than malevolent influence. The blessing ceremony was conducted in the photographer's studio, with holy water sprinkled on each piece of equipment, while prayers were offered for the peaceful rest of any souls that might be connected to the instruments. The blessing appeared to be effective in reducing the frequency of photographic anomalies, though Delacroix continued to report occasional unusual images throughout his career. He eventually passed the equipment to his son, who continued the family photography business well into the 1950s, but maintained the practice of having all equipment blessed annually as a precautionary measure. The Delacroix studio became known throughout New York for the exceptional quality of their portrait work, though they never advertised the supernatural history of their equipment or the special precautions they took to ensure the safety of their clients. The shadow behind the bride became Salem's most persistent mystery, a reminder that some moments in time carry weight beyond their apparent significance, and that the tools humans create to document their lives can sometimes capture more than they intend. The photograph itself disappeared from public knowledge after William Morrison's death, but copies made from the original negative continued to surface in antique shops and estate sales throughout New England with disturbing regularity. Each time the image appeared, it seemed to bring with it a sense of unfinished business, as if the shadow figure was still searching for what it had sought in that October parlor more than a century ago. Local historians who studied the case noted that Catherine Morrison's death marked the beginning of a pattern that persisted for decades throughout the region. Young women in Salem and surrounding communities began reporting dreams similar to those Catherine had described, dreams of twilight gardens and whispered secrets that felt more real than waking life. Several marriages in the town ended in tragedy during the early 1900s, always involving brides who had been photographed in formal wedding portraits and who had died under mysterious circumstances within months of their ceremonies. The pattern was subtle enough that it might have been dismissed as coincidence, if not for the persistence of certain specific elements. In each case, the bride had reported unusual dreams following her wedding, dreams that involved conversations with people from earlier historical periods and visits to impossible landscapes that combined familiar local elements with fantastical variations. The wedding photographs of these women, when they could be located and examined, often showed subtle anomalies, unexpected shadows, figures that seemed slightly out of focus despite proper technical execution, or areas where the photographic emulsion appeared to have been exposed to light sources that were not present during the actual sitting. Dr. Helena Marsh, a physician who specialized in what would later be called psychiatric medicine, began documenting these cases in the 1920s as part of her research into the psychological effects of major life transitions on susceptible individuals. Her private notes, discovered in her papers after her death, revealed her growing conviction that some locations and objects could serve as conduits for experiences that transcended normal psychological explanations. She theorized that certain sensitive individuals might be capable of perceiving information or influences from past events that had occurred in the same physical location, particularly when those past events involved intense emotional experiences similar to their own current circumstances. Dr. Marsh's research included interviews with family members of the affected women, examination of their personal belongings and living spaces, and careful analysis of any photographic evidence that remained available. Her conclusions, never published during her lifetime because of their controversial nature, suggested that the boundary between past and present was more permeable than conventional understanding acknowledged, and that some individuals possessed a natural sensitivity to temporal overlap that could be triggered by specific combinations of location, emotional state, and external stimuli such as photographic processes. The mystery endures because it touches something fundamental about the nature of love and loss, about the possibility that strong emotions can leave impressions on the physical world that persist long after the people who felt them have passed into history. Whether the shadow in Catherine Morrison's wedding photograph represents the presence of the dead, the power of suggestion working on minds predisposed to see patterns where none exist, or some as yet undiscovered aspect of human consciousness that can interact with photographic technology in unexpected ways, it stands as a testament to the human need to believe that some connections transcend the boundaries of life and death. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied copies of the Morrison wedding photograph using contemporary technology have been unable to provide definitive explanations for the shadow figure, though they have documented several interesting anomalies in the image's structure. Digital analysis reveals that the shadow possesses the same optical properties as the other figures in the photograph, ruling out later manipulation or fraud. The shadow interacts with the light in the image in ways that are consistent with a three-dimensional presence, casting its own subtle shadows and reflecting light sources in a manner that suggests physical substance, despite its apparently incorporeal nature. Perhaps most significantly, attempts to enhance or clarify the shadow figure using digital technology have consistently produced unexpected results. Computer enhancement of the shadow often reveals additional details that were not visible in the original image, suggestion of facial features, indications of period clothing, and, most disturbing of all, what appears to be direct eye contact between the shadow figure and the camera lens. These enhanced details seem to change slightly with each analysis, as if the shadow figure continues to exist in some active state within the photograph rather than remaining a static, captured image. The enduring fascination with Catherine Morrison's story reflects our collective understanding that some mysteries resist rational explanation while simultaneously demanding our attention and respect. The photograph continues to surface in various forms, sometimes as reproductions in books about supernatural photography, sometimes as copies discovered in family archives, and occasionally as original prints that appear in estate sales with no clear provenance. Each appearance renews interest in the case and brings new attempts to understand what Edmund Hartwell's camera captured in that Salem parlor more than a century ago. The most recent documented appearance of the photograph occurred in 2018, when it was discovered among the effects of a deceased antique dealer in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The dealer, Margaret Kensington, had apparently acquired the image sometime in the 1990s, but had never displayed it in her shop, keeping it instead in a private collection of items she considered too significant or potentially dangerous for general sale. Her estate inventory included detailed notes about the photograph's history and her own experiences with the image during the years it remained in her possession. Kensington's notes described a gradual change in the photograph's appearance over time, with the shadow figure becoming increasingly distinct, and the crack in the glass appearing to spread in subtle patterns that formed geometric designs around the mysterious presence. She reported that the image seemed to affect the behavior of other antiques in her collection, particularly items that dated from the late 19th century. Clocks from that period would stop at precisely the same time each day. Music boxes would play melodies that no one could identify, and mirrors would occasionally reflect images of rooms that did not match their actual surroundings. More disturbing were Kensington's accounts of dreams that began shortly after she acquired the photograph, dreams that closely paralleled Catherine Morrison's descriptions. From her final letters, The antique dealer found herself walking through twilight gardens, populated by figures from different historical periods, engaging in conversations about the nature of time and the possibility of communication across the boundary between life and death. These dreams were so vivid and consistent that Kensington began keeping a journal to record the information she received, filling dozens of notebooks with historical details that she later verified through research at local libraries and historical societies. The journal entries revealed that the dream figures provided Kensington with specific information about Salem's colonial history, including details about families, properties, and events that were not widely known or easily researched. The accuracy of this information, later confirmed by historians at the Essex Institute, suggested that Kensington was somehow gaining access to historical knowledge through her dream experiences, rather than through conventional research methods. Most significantly, the dreams provided her with detailed information about Sarah Whitmore's life and death that corresponded perfectly with the sparse colonial records while filling in gaps that no historical document had ever addressed. According to Kensington's dream journals, Sarah Whitmore had been born in 1673 to a family of moderate prosperity that had established itself in Salem during the early years of settlement. She had been raised with the expectation that she would make an advantageous marriage that would strengthen both her own family's position and that of her future husband, following the social patterns that governed colonial society. Her engagement to merchant Thomas Hartwell, a possible ancestor of photographer Edmund Hartwell, had been arranged by their families but had grown into genuine affection over the months of their courtship. The wedding was to have taken place in October 1694, during the harvest season when both families could celebrate without interfering with the agricultural and commercial activities that sustained their livelihoods. Sarah had spent months preparing for her new role as a merchant's wife, learning the complex skills needed to manage a household, supervise servants, and support her husband's business activities through appropriate social connections. The wedding dress had been ordered from Boston, made of silk imported from China, and decorated with lace that had been crafted by skilled artisans in England. On the morning of her wedding day, Sarah had awakened from vivid dreams about walking through gardens that seemed to exist in a realm between the physical world and some other dimension where time moved differently and the dead could communicate with the living. The dreams had been recurring for several weeks, growing more intense and detailed as the wedding approached, but she had attributed them to the natural nervousness of a young woman facing a major life transition. The garden in her dreams was populated by figures she recognized as ancestors and family members who had died during her childhood, all of whom seemed eager to share information about the nature of existence after death. The wedding ceremony had proceeded normally until the moment when Sarah and Thomas were to exchange vows. According to witnesses, Sarah had suddenly stopped speaking in the middle of her response to the minister's questions, her eyes focusing on something behind the assembled congregation that no one else could see. She remained frozen in that position for several minutes, apparently listening to someone or something that only she could perceive, before suddenly announcing that she could not complete the ceremony because she had learned something that changed everything she thought she understood about life and death. Sarah had then walked out of the church, still wearing her wedding dress, and had not been seen alive again. Her body was discovered 3 days later in the woods, near the cemetery where she would eventually be buried, positioned as if she had laid down to sleep and simply never awakened. Like Catherine Morrison 2 centuries later, Sarah showed no signs of violence or illness, and the colonial physician could determine no cause of death beyond what he described as a failure of the vital spirits to maintain their connection to the earthly form. The colonial records indicated that Sarah had been buried with unusual haste and ceremony, suggesting that the community leaders wanted to minimize discussion of the strange circumstances surrounding her death. The burial took place at night, with only immediate family members present, and the grave was marked with a simple wooden post that bore only her initials and the year of death. The records noted that several strange occurrences had been reported in the vicinity of the grave during the weeks following the burial, including sightings of a young woman in wedding dress walking through the cemetery at dawn and dusk. Kensington's journal suggested that Sarah Whitmore had somehow learned, through her pre-wedding dreams, that death was not the absolute ending that colonial Christian doctrine proclaimed it to be. The dream conversations had revealed to her the possibility of maintaining consciousness and identity after the death of the physical body, but only under specific conditions that required careful preparation and timing. Sarah had realized that completing her wedding would commit her to a life path that would make such preparation impossible, leading to her decision to abandon the ceremony and seek out the knowledge she needed to ensure her survival beyond death. The antique dealer's notes theorized that Sarah had succeeded in her preparations, maintaining her consciousness and connection to the physical world through some process that allowed her to remain present at the location of her burial. When the cemetery was relocated in 1847 and the Morrison house was built on the site, Sarah had found herself sharing physical space with a new family while remaining invisible and undetected by normal human senses. The presence of sensitive photographic equipment during Catherine Morrison's wedding had provided Sarah with the first opportunity in decades to make her presence known and to communicate with someone who might understand her situation. The photograph had served as a bridge between Sarah's disembodied existence and Catherine's growing sensitivity to non-physical phenomena, creating a connection that allowed Sarah to share her knowledge about the nature of consciousness after death. Catherine's dreams and behavioral changes following her wedding had been the result of receiving information and instruction from someone who had successfully navigated the transition between life and death while maintaining her individual identity and awareness. According to this interpretation, Catherine's death had not been a tragedy, but rather a graduation, a successful completion of the process that Sarah had begun teaching her through dreams and supernatural communication. Catherine had learned how to separate her consciousness from her physical body while retaining her memories, personality, and connection to the people and places she loved. Her peaceful expression at the moment of death and the precise positioning of her body to mirror the wedding photograph suggested that she had achieved exactly what she had been working toward during the months of mysterious experiences. Kensington's journal entries from her final years indicated that she had begun to experience the same kind of preparatory dreams that had affected both Sarah and Catherine, though her advanced age and practical nature allowed her to approach the phenomenon with less fear and more curiosity than her predecessors had shown. She documented a gradual process of learning how to maintain awareness during what she called practice separations, brief periods during which her consciousness seemed to detach from her body while remaining connected to it through some invisible link. The antique dealer's final journal entry, written just days before her death, expressed her gratitude for having been chosen to serve as a temporary guardian for the photograph and her confidence that she was ready to join Sarah and Catherine in whatever form of existence they had discovered beyond death. She noted that the photograph would soon find its way to another sensitive individual, who would continue the chain of knowledge and preparation that had begun with Sarah Whitmore's interrupted wedding more than 3 centuries earlier. Following Kensington's death, the photograph disappeared from her estate before the official inventory could be completed, leading to speculation that she had made arrangements for its transfer to someone who understood its significance. Several psychic investigators and paranormal researchers reported being contacted by anonymous sources offering to sell or display the image, but none of these contacts resulted in successful transactions. The photograph seemed to have developed its own agenda for determining when and where it would appear, following a pattern that prioritized meaningful connections over financial or academic interests. Contemporary digital analysis of copies made from the original negative has revealed additional layers of complexity in the image that were not visible using 19th century technology. High resolution scanning shows that the shadow figure contains internal structure and detail that suggests a complete human form rather than a simple silhouette. The figure appears to be wearing clothing consistent with late 17th century fashion, including a wedding dress that matches historical descriptions of Sarah Whitmore's intended bridal outfit. Most remarkably, the enhanced images show clear facial features within the shadow, revealing a young woman whose appearance matches written descriptions of Sarah found in colonial family documents. The crack in the glass plate, when examined under extreme magnification, displays geometric patterns that follow mathematical principles found in sacred geometry and architectural designs from various mystical traditions. These patterns appear to have been created from within the glass itself, rather than being imposed from external force, suggesting that the crack represents some kind of energy release or dimensional shift that occurred during the photographic process. The patterns continue to evolve over time, with new geometric elements appearing in copies made from the same negative at different points in history. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to recreate the conditions that produced the Morrison wedding photograph, using period-appropriate equipment and techniques in locations with similar historical backgrounds. These experiments have produced several interesting results, including photographs that show unexplained figures, unusual light patterns, and what appear to be images of people and objects from different time periods superimposed on contemporary scenes. However, none of these experimental images has achieved the clarity and purposeful communication apparent in the original Morrison photograph. The most successful recreation attempt was conducted in 2015 by a team of researchers working in cooperation with the Salem Historical Society. Using cameras and developing equipment that had been manufactured in the 1890s, they photographed a staged wedding scene in the parlor of a house built on land that had previously served as a colonial cemetery. The resulting images showed several anomalies, including shadows that did not correspond to any physical objects present during the photography session, and areas of the image that appeared to show the same room decorated and furnished in the style of an earlier historical period. One photograph from this experiment showed what appeared to be a complete colonial-era wedding ceremony taking place in the same room where the modern recreation was being staged, with two complete sets of wedding participants occupying the same space, but apparently existing in different time periods. The colonial figures appeared as translucent overlays on the modern scene, suggesting that some locations can simultaneously contain multiple temporal realities that become visible only under specific technological and environmental conditions. These modern experiments have contributed to a growing body of theoretical work that attempts to explain supernatural photography using concepts from quantum physics and consciousness research. Some researchers propose that photographic plates or digital sensors can detect forms of electromagnetic energy that are not visible to human senses, energy patterns that might be generated by consciousness or memory traces embedded in specific locations. Others suggest that the photographic process itself might create temporary alterations in the fabric of space-time that allow information from different temporal periods to become accessible and recordable. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a physicist at MIT, who has studied the Morrison photograph extensively, theorizes that certain locations can serve as temporal junction points, where past events continue to generate measurable energy signatures. According to her hypothesis, sensitive individuals can perceive these energy signatures as dreams, visions, or direct communication with consciousness patterns from earlier time periods. Photographic equipment, she suggests, might be capable of detecting and recording these energy patterns under specific conditions, creating permanent visual records of temporal overlap phenomena. Richardson's research has focused on identifying the environmental and technical factors that seem to correlate with successful supernatural photography. Her analysis suggests that locations with significant emotional history, particularly sites where intense experiences of love, loss, or major life transitions have occurred, generate the strongest temporal energy signatures. The presence of sensitive individuals who are experiencing their own emotionally significant events appears to amplify these signatures, creating optimal conditions for photographic documentation of paranormal phenomena. The emotional resonance theory helps explain why wedding photography seems particularly susceptible to supernatural influences. Weddings represent one of the most intense emotional experiences in human life, involving not only the immediate participants, but also extended families and communities who invest significant psychological energy in the success and happiness of the union. When wedding ceremonies take place in locations that have historical connections to similar events, the emotional energy of the current celebration might interact with residual energy from past weddings, creating conditions that allow temporal boundaries to become permeable. This interpretation suggests that the Morrison wedding photograph captured not just an image of Catherine and William's celebration, but also a visual record of the emotional and temporal resonances that connected their wedding to Sarah Whitmore's interrupted ceremony 2 centuries earlier. The shadow figure might represent not just Sarah's individual consciousness, but the accumulated emotional energy of all the love, hope, and tragedy associated with weddings that had taken place on that specific piece of land over multiple generations. The continuing appearances of the Morrison photograph in various locations and contexts suggest that it serves a purpose beyond simple historical documentation. Each time the image surfaces, it seems to find its way to individuals who are experiencing circumstances similar to those faced by Sarah, Catherine, and the other women who have been affected by whatever phenomenon the photograph represents. These individuals often report that their initial encounter with the image triggers a series of experiences that parallel the historical pattern: unusual dreams, enhanced sensitivity to non-physical presences, and gradually increasing awareness of possibilities that extend beyond conventional understanding of life and death. The photograph appears to function as a teaching tool, providing sensitive individuals with access to knowledge and experiences that can help them navigate their own spiritual and psychological development. Rather than being simply a record of past events, it seems to serve as an active bridge between different states of consciousness and different dimensions of human experience. The women who encounter the image often describe feeling chosen or called to participate in something larger than their individual lives, as if they have been selected to continue a tradition of knowledge and awareness that began with Sarah Whitmore's decision to abandon her wedding in pursuit of greater understanding. Modern recipients of the photograph's influence report that the experience, while initially disturbing or frightening, ultimately leads to expanded awareness and a deeper understanding of the interconnected nature of human consciousness across time and space. They describe learning techniques for maintaining awareness during sleep, for communicating with consciousness patterns from other time periods, and for preparing their own consciousness for the transition beyond physical death. These abilities, they report, bring both responsibilities and opportunities that extend far beyond their ordinary daily lives. The pattern suggests that the Morrison wedding photograph represents more than an isolated supernatural occurrence. It appears to be part of an ongoing process of human consciousness evolution that has been taking place across multiple generations and continues to unfold in contemporary times. Each woman who encounters the photograph and successfully integrates its teachings becomes part of a network of consciousness that transcends normal temporal and spatial limitations, contributing to what might be understood as a collective awakening to possibilities that mainstream society has yet to acknowledge or understand. The mystery of the shadow behind the bride ultimately points to questions about the nature of human consciousness, the reality of survival after death, and the possibility that love and knowledge can persist across centuries to guide and teach those who are ready to receive such guidance. Whether understood as literal supernatural communication or as symbolic representation of human psychological and spiritual potential, the photograph continues to challenge our assumptions about the boundaries of reality and the limitations of human experience. As new copies of the image continue to surface and new individuals report encounters with its influence, the story of Catherine Morrison and Sarah Whitmore remains dynamically alive, still unfolding, still teaching, still demonstrating that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but to be lived, experienced, and passed forward to future generations, who will carry the knowledge even further into humanity's expanding understanding of what it means to be conscious beings in a universe filled with possibilities that exceed our current comprehension.